They were a family torn apart by silence. But what's coming for their farm doesn't care about their grudges. It only cares about their blood. 3 generations, 1 night, and a creature that shouldn't exist. The silence in the farmhouse kitchen was a physical thing, a 4th entity at the table. It was older than the 3 men who sat there, a dense, heavy blanket woven from decades of unspoken bitterness and mismatched grief. It settled in the dust motes that danced like frantic tiny ghosts in the single buttery beam of late afternoon sun, slanting through the grimy window. It clung to the chipped enamel of the mismatched mugs, and it seeped into the very grain of the long, scarred wooden table where they sat, miles apart in their own private worlds. Ignacio, the patriarch, occupied the chair closest to the window, his back a rigid, unyielding plank, as if mirroring the ancient oak he could see silhouetted on the horizon. His hands, resting on the tabletop, were living maps of a life spent wrestling a living from the soil. The knuckles were swollen, arthritic knots, the fingernails permanently rimmed with the dark, rich earth of his land. They twitched now and then, a restless energy that had nowhere to go. He wasn't looking at the fields, which were ripe for another pass, or the sagging fence line that cried out for mending. He was studying the sky. It was a flat, bruised purple, the color of a day-old contusion, promising a night that would be not just cold, but mean. He tapped the tarnished brass of an old barometer on the wall, a ritual he performed 3 times a day. The needle hadn't moved. "Sky's got a bad liver today," he muttered, his voice a dry rasp directed more at the window pane than at the living. Bad things travel under a sky like that. The air's holding its breath. Across from him, Marcos didn't look up. He was hunched over a thick ledger, a battlefield of hostile numbers and receipts that felt like tiny paper daggers to his exhausted mind. A vein throbbed in his temple, a steady, angry drumbeat that matched the frantic, nearly silent scratching of his ballpoint pen. He was a man wound as tight as a watch spring, a man of practicalities and problems that could be measured in dollars and cents. His father's poetic omens were just irritating static, a distraction from the real war he was losing. The new water pump, the one he'd gone into debt for, was sputtering again. The price of feed had climbed another 10%, and the bank's latest letter, tucked under a pile of bills, felt like a patient predator, circling, waiting for him to bleed out. He circled a number in the book so hard the paper tore with a faint ripping sound. A low grunt of frustration escaped his lips, the only sound he'd contributed to the room's symphony of silence in over an hour. And then there was Leo. Slumped in his chair at the far end of the table, he was an island of hostile modernity in a vast, quiet sea of rustic decay. The pristine white earbuds snaking from his ears were a fortress wall, blocking out the suffocating quiet and the nonsensical mutterings of a grandfather he barely knew. The vibrant, chaotic glow of his phone screen reflected in his bored eyes. On it, his friends were at a party, their faces laughing in short looping videos, their messages a stream of inside jokes and plans for the night he was missing. "How's Hicksville? You milk a cow yet?" one message read. He typed back, "Losing my mind. This place smells like disappointment." To Leo, the farm wasn't a heritage. It was a punishment, a mandatory weekend visit to the land of no Wi-Fi, no fun, and a simmering family tension that was so thick it made the air feel greasy. He'd been roped into helping with the pump earlier, and his clumsy, resentful efforts had resulted in a stripped bolt, a spray of oily water on his clean jacket, and a glare from his father that was colder than the November wind. He was counting the seconds until Sunday evening, when he could flee back to the concrete and the welcome noise of the city, a place that felt more like home than this silent, rotting purgatory. The sun finally surrendered, dipping below the horizon with a final, weak smear of orange. The kitchen plunged into a deep gloom that felt older and more profound than a simple lack of light. Ignacio rose, his joints protesting with a series of cracks like dry twigs snapping underfoot. He lit an old, soot-stained kerosene lamp. Its warm, flickering flame immediately threw their shadows onto the walls, making them dance and loom like malformed giants, shrinking the room, making it feel more claustrophobic than ever. The cloying, sweet smell of burning oil filled the air. Marco slammed the ledger shut. The sound was as startling and violent as a gunshot in the stillness. Pointless, he sighed, the word heavy with defeat. He scrubbed his face with both hands, as if trying to wipe away the exhaustion etched there. He glanced at his son, a flicker of something unreadable. Disappointment, maybe even a painful flicker of envy for Leo's easy disconnect, in his eyes before the mask of stoic frustration snapped back into place. Leo felt the shift in the room, the familiar, dreadful prelude to either another pointless circular argument or a heavy, accusatory silence that was somehow worse. He pulled one earbud out, the tiny, tinny sound of a bass line leaking into the quiet. He was about to shove it back in, to retreat fully into his own world, when a sound from outside made all three of them freeze. It was not the familiar hoot of an owl. It was not the yip of a distant coyote pack. It was a cry, long and low and guttural, that seemed to vibrate up from the very bedrock of the earth, through the soles of their feet and into their bones. It was a sound of profound, tearing pain, or of a hunger so deep it was an agony. It echoed from the direction of the far fields, carrying a note of such unnatural wrongness that the fine hairs on their arms stood on end. It rose in pitch, and then was choked off abruptly, as if a hand had been clamped over the screamer's mouth. Ignazio's head snapped up, his eyes wide and stark in the unsteady lamplight. Marco stood motionless, his hand hovering over the closed ledger, his jaw clenched. Even Leo, phone forgotten in his hand, was staring at the dark, empty square of the window, a cold, tight knot forming in the pit of his stomach. The cry faded, leaving behind a silence that was no longer just heavy or empty. It was a listening silence, and it felt as though something out there in the crushing darkness was listening back. The morning broke cold and gray, the sky a lid of solid, unforgiving cloud. The memory of the night's cry lingered in the air like a foul taste, a question no one wanted to ask. Marcos was already up, a thermos of black coffee in his hand, his face set in a mask of grim, practical determination. He was a man who solved problems with tools and sweat, and he was going to find a logical explanation for that sound. A bobcat, a stray dog caught in a trap, anything but the formless dread that had kept him awake all night. "Leo, you're with me," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a request. It was a conscription. Leo followed him out into the damp morning, his expensive city sneakers immediately soaking through from the dew-heavy grass. He hated this. He hated the raw, earthy smell of manure and wet soil, the uneven ground that threatened to turn his ankle. The feeling of being an unwilling character in a story he wanted no part of. On the way to the fence line, Marcos tried to bridge the gap with the only language he knew. "See that post?" he said, pointing. "It's loose. You always drive the new post in next to the old one. Use the old hole as a guide, but give it new earth to bite into." Leo just grunted a non-committal reply, his eyes on his feet. They found it near the old stream, in a small clearing shielded by a stand of birch trees. The sight stopped them both dead in their tracks, the half-formed lecture dying on Marcos's lips. It had been one of their best cows, a healthy 2-year-old heifer. Now, it was a ruin of flesh and bone, a grotesque sculpture of violence. This was not the work of any predator they knew. Coyotes would have nipped and torn, leaving a ragged mess. A cougar would have gone for the neck and likely dragged its kill into the brush. This was something else entirely. The animal's torso was ripped open with a terrifying, almost surgical force. The ribs snapped cleanly and splayed outwards like the struts of a broken umbrella. The ground around it was churned up, a dark, muddy mess, but strangely, there were no clear tracks, no paw prints, no sign of the pack that would have been needed to inflict such catastrophic damage. More unnerving was the lack of blood. There should have been gallons soaking the earth, but the ground was merely damp, as if the life had been siphoned out of the creature. Marco stared, his face a pale, sickly green. His practical, orderly mind was racing, trying to fit this obscene scene into a logical box. But the pieces wouldn't connect. The sheer, brutal force The clean snaps of bone, the missing blood. It was all wrong. It was impossible. A shuffling sound in the leaves made them both jump. Ignacio stood at the edge of the clearing, his old walking stick clutched in a white-knuckled hand. He took one long, slow look at the carnage, at the impossible tableau of violence, and his weathered face seemed to age another decade. He made a small, trembling sign of the cross over his chest, a gesture Leo had only ever seen in old movies. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a ragged, airy whisper that was almost carried away by the morning breeze. Lobisomum. The word, ancient and heavy with dread, hung in the cold air. It was the spark that lit the fuse of Marcos's fear and frustration. "Don't you start with that superstitious nonsense, Dad," he exploded, his voice sharp and loud, a desperate attempt to impose order on a chaotic world. He couldn't process the horror in front of him, so he lashed out at the one thing he could fight. Remember the blight that was going to ruin the corn? It was just aphids. $100 in pesticide fixed it. $100 you said was wasted on new poisons. This is not aphids, Ignacio said, his eyes still fixed on the dead cow, a profound sadness in them. This is a warning. The land is sick, and this is the fever. You bring your noise and your debts, and you don't listen to what it's telling you. It's a wolf, a big rabid wolf, Marcos insisted, his voice strained, trying to convince himself as much as his father. Leo, seeing his father's desperate rationality as the only sane anchor in the situation, scoffed, his fear manifesting as scorn. "Yeah, Grandpa, a werewolf, right. Let me guess, we need silver bullets and a crucifix?" He kicked at a clump of dirt, a gesture of pure, dismissive arrogance that he hoped masked the terror coiling in his gut. The discovery had become a weapon, and they were all using it to inflict new wounds over old scars. The rift between them had not been bridged by the shared horror. It had been torn into a chasm. They left the carcass for the vultures, though none were circling, another strange detail, and returned to the house, the argument continuing in clipped, angry sentences. Marcos, retreating into his fortress of practicality, spent the afternoon cleaning his heavy-gauge shotgun with meticulous, angry movements. He pulled out 3 cruel-looking steel bear traps from the back of the shed, their metal teeth rusty and menacing, and set them near the edge of the woods. Ignacio watched him from the porch, his face a mask of sorrowful resignation. He turned and went inside, where Leo saw him through the window, sitting by the unlit lamp, his lips moving in a silent prayer, his rosary beads clicking softly through his gnarled fingers. Night fell again, a swift final drawing of a black curtain. The bruised purple of the sky had given way to an impenetrable, starless black. They ate another silent meal, the tension a fourth person at the table. Leo wanted to retreat to his room, to the sanctuary of his headphones, but he found himself unable to. He kept glancing at the windows, at the deep, oppressive blackness outside, imagining yellow eyes staring back. The sound started around 10 o'clock. It was a soft, rhythmic scrape. Scrape, scrape, against the thick oak of the front door. It wasn't the frantic scratching of an animal. It was slow, deliberate, intelligent. It was the sound of something testing the wood, feeling for a weakness, for the grain. Marcos grabbed the shotgun, his knuckles white, his face slick with a sheen of cold sweat. Ignacio began to chant under his breath, a low, desperate sound in a language Leo didn't recognize. Leo backed away from the door, his heart a frantic, trapped bird beating against his ribs. He chanced to look through the small, diamond-shaped pane of glass in the living room window, the one his grandmother had always loved. For a split second, a shape blotted out the darkness. It was huge, impossibly so, a silhouette of broad, powerful shoulders and a long, low-slung head, its form a nightmarish fusion of man and beast. It was standing upright. It turned its head, as if it knew he was watching, and Leo saw the brief, terrifying, intelligent glint of yellow eyes. He saw them, and he knew they saw him. A strangled cry tore from Leo's throat. The sound broke Marcos's paralysis. He yanked the front door open just a few inches and fired the shotgun blindly into the night. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, a cannon shot that vibrated through the floor. It was answered not by a yelp of pain or the thud of a falling body, but by a roar. A deep, guttural, enraged roar that was filled with an ancient predatory intelligence. It was the sound of a king whose sovereignty had been challenged, not a beast that had been harmed. Marcos slammed the door, his face ashen, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He fumbled with the heavy iron deadbolt, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries. The bar finally slid home with a loud final thunk that echoed through the house, a sound of grim finality. They were not defenders anymore. They were prisoners in their own home. The echo of the deadbolt faded, replaced by the sound of their own frantic, ragged breathing in the flickering lamplight. Panic was a wild animal loose in the room, threatening to claw its way up their throats. But Marcos, a man who built his life on tangible solutions, wrestled it down with a surge of adrenaline. Fear was a luxury. Action was a necessity. "The generator," he barked, his voice tight but controlled, slicing through the terrified silence. The floodlights. Leo, in the workshop, the big roll of heavy-duty extension cords. Now! For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Leo obeyed without question, without sarcasm. The cynical city boy was gone, burned away by the sight in the window and the unearthly roar. He was now just a terrified kid running on pure instinct, grateful for an order to follow. He scrambled into the cluttered workshop, the smell of oil and rust a strangely comforting anchor to reality. His hands shook as he heaved the heavy, coiled orange snake of cable from a hook. Marcos worked with a fierce, desperate energy, a man possessed. He was back in his element, fighting a problem he could, in theory, solve with machines and electricity. He hauled the heavy generator from the shed, its cold metal a solid, reassuring weight. He positioned the 2 industrial floodlights he used for late-night repairs at opposite corners of the house, angling them outwards to create an overlapping field of stark, unforgiving light. There would be no shadows for anything to hide in. He drove metal stakes into the damp earth with a sledgehammer, the percussive thud a defiant rhythm against the night silence, and ran a line from the generator to the wire fences enclosing the immediate yard. He was building a fortress of modern logic, a bubble of man-made power against the primeval dark. Ignacio watched from the kitchen doorway, his face a mask of deep, profound doubt. But he said nothing. He clutched his rosary beads, his knuckles white. He knew this was a battle his son needed to fight his own way, a faith that needed to be tested before it could be broken. With a final, angry pull of the starter cord, the generator sputtered, coughed a plume of blue smoke, and then roared to life. Its loud, mechanical drone was a beautiful sound, a human sound that pushed back against the oppressive quiet. One by one, the floodlights flickered on, humming as they warmed up, then bathing the farmhouse and the yard in a sterile, brilliant white light. The darkness was violently shoved back, held at bay at the distant tree line. They could see every blade of grass, every stone, every fallen leaf in hyper-detailed clarity. A collective sigh of relief passed between the 3 men, a shaky, shared exhalation. For a few precious, fragile moments, they felt safe. Marcos leaned against the wall, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy hand. He shot a quick, triumphant glance at his father. See? Logic. Steel and electricity. That's how you fight the monsters of the world. They sat in the sterile bubble of light, listening to the steady, reassuring drone of the engine. The tension began to recede, replaced by a jittery exhaustion. Marcos even attempted a conversation, explaining the principles of the generator to Leo, a rare, clumsy attempt to connect. "It's all about converting mechanical energy into electrical energy," he began, but his voice trailed off, because the monster was learning. They didn't see it at first, but they heard it. A low, frustrated growl from the edge of the woods, a sound of thwarted rage. Then the heavy pacing tread of something massive moving just beyond the reach of the light, circling them, testing the perimeter of their electric cage. The tension, which had briefly subsided, began to wind itself tight again, a knot of dread in their stomachs. The minutes stretched into an hour. Then, The first flicker. One of the floodlights on the far side of the house blinked once, then twice, then went out. Marco swore under his breath, thinking it was a faulty bulb. A moment later, it flickered back on. Leo, who was staring out the window, his face pressed against the cold glass, saw why. A large, dark rock, the size of a man's head, arced out of the blackness and struck the base of the light fixture with a dull thud. The creature wasn't a mindless brute. It was a tactician. Another rock sailed out of the night, then another. They weren't aiming for the lights anymore. They were aiming for the thin, vulnerable extension cords snaking across the yard, the arteries of their defense. The generator's steady hum began to sound strained, the engine sputtering as the load fluctuated. The lights flickered again, more erratically this time, creating a dizzying, nauseating strobe effect. The shadows leaped and danced like demons, playing tricks on their eyes. One moment the yard was there, the next it was gone. "It's going to go!" Leo yelled, his voice cracking with pubescent terror. Marco stood frozen, a statue of impotence, watching his fortress of logic and reason being dismantled piece by rocks and a primal, malevolent cunning. The generator gave a final wheezing cough, its defiant roar dying into a pathetic, gurgling groan. The world plunged into an absolute, suffocating blackness. The sudden, total silence was more terrifying than any noise. For a single heartbeat of reality, there was nothing. Then a new sound cut through the stillness, a loud, metallic twang from the yard, like a giant guitar string snapping, followed by the zinging sound of recoiling wire. The electric fence had been breached. A low, guttural sound drifted from the darkness. It was a sound of satisfaction, almost a chuckle. And then, the soft, deliberate crunch of heavy footsteps on the gravel driveway. Much, much closer this time. The darkness that flooded the room was not an absence of light. It was a presence. It was thick and suffocating, pressing in on them, stealing the air from their lungs and replacing it with the cold, metallic taste of fear. Marcos's modern world of switches and engines had been snuffed out as easily as a candle, and in the void it left, a different, older kind of power began to stir. For a long, terrifying minute, they sat in the dark, paralyzed, listening to the slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the house. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Each step was a hammer blow against their fragile sanity. Marcos fumbled for his phone, his thumb swiping frantically at the screen. The words glowed with a cruel irony. No service. He was cut off, his one link to the 21st century severed. He was as isolated as his ancestors had been 100 years ago. It was Ignacio who broke the paralysis. He shuffled past his frozen son and grandson, his movements slow but unerring in the familiar geography of his own home. He found the kerosene lamp on the mantelpiece, and with a hand that trembled only slightly, struck a match. The small, brave flame sputtered to life, a tiny orange star in a universe of black. It pushed the deepest shadows back, revealing the stark terror etched on Marcos's and Leo's faces. "Your wires are broken," Ignacio said, his voice quiet but resonant, seeming to draw strength from the primal flame. "Your engine is silent. Now we do it my way." There was no argument left in Marcos. The last of his pride had been swallowed by the dark. He simply nodded, his face slack with a defeat so profound it looked like illness. Ignacio became a man transformed, possessed by an ancient purpose. He moved with a new authority. "Leo, in the pantry, on the top shelf, behind the preserves, there is a small tin box that was your great-grandmother's. Bring it. And salt. The big burlap bag from the cellar. Marcos, the fireplace. I need cold ash from yesterday's fire." His orders were strange, nonsensical, but they were a plan, a lifeline in a sea of terror. Leo, grateful for the direction, fumbled through the dark pantry, his fingers brushing against dusty jars of peaches and beans, until they found the cold, smooth surface of a small tin box. Inside, nestled in yellowed cotton, were dried, brittle bundles of herbs he didn't recognize, their scent faintly bitter and medicinal. He and Marcos worked without speaking, gathering the bizarre ingredients. Ignacio took a heavy wooden bowl and mixed the salt in the cold gray ash, his lips moving in a silent, rhythmic prayer. The words lost to the room, but the intent clear. Then the ritual began. He handed a bundle of the dried herbs to Leo. "Wolfsbane," he said simply, as if discussing the weather. "It will not kill him, but it will offend his senses. Hang a piece over every window, every door." He took the bowl of salt and ash and began to walk the perimeter of the main room, dipping his gnarled fingers in and drawing a wavering, complex symbol on each entryway. It was a slow, meticulous process, a ceremony of defiance against the thing that was now audibly sniffing at the back door. As he worked, Leo, driven by a desperate modern need to understand, pulled out his phone again. The battery was at 15%. He typed in Lobisomum folklore Brazil protection symbols. The connection was agonizingly slow, the loading bar creeping across the screen. He had to try different search terms, wading through fantasy gaming sites until he found a digital archive of anthropological studies. His screen glowed in the dark, a tiny beacon of the 21st century illuminating secrets from the first. And then he saw it, a crudely drawn symbol, almost identical to the one his grandfather was painting on the door. He scrolled down, his heart pounding. He found it then. A scanned, blurry local newspaper article from 1958. "Unexplained livestock mutilations plague rural farmstead," the headline read. The article detailed a series of vicious attacks that had terrified the small community. Attacks that had stopped as suddenly and mysteriously as they'd begun. The location mentioned, a small farmstead near the Itapecuru River, was his family's land. A shiver ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked at his grandfather, no longer seeing a senile old man lost in the past, but a guardian, a living library of a history he had never known existed. "He's at the back door," Marcos whispered, his voice tight. They could all hear it now, a low, guttural sniffing, the wet sound of a nose pressed against the cracks in the wood, followed by the light, testing scratch of a single, massive claw. Ignacio didn't stop his work. As he painted the final symbol on the back door, he began to speak, his voice taking on the low, storytelling cadence of his ancestors. "This is not the first time he has come. My grandfather, his name was Bento, he saw it. It was during the great drought when the land was cracked and bleeding, and men fought over water. The beast is of this soil, Leo. It is a part of its spirit. It sleeps for generations, sometimes for a century, but it wakes when the land is in pain, when it is disrespected, or when the bloodline that tends it is fractured and weak." He glanced at Marcos, a flicker of sad meaning in his old eyes. "It does not hunt only for food. It hunts to reclaim what it has lost. It senses division. It sees the rot in a family's heart, and it seeks to cleanse it with tooth and claw." The scratching at the door grew louder, more insistent, then turned into an angry, frustrated snarl. The creature outside could smell them, could sense their fear, but something was holding it back. The ancient symbols, the bitter herbs, the old ways were working. For how long, none of them knew. But for now, in the flickering lamplight of a bygone century surrounded by salt, ash, and whispered stories, they had earned a fragile, terrifying peace. The fragile peace held for what felt like an eternity, but could only have been an hour. The creature outside had grown unnervingly quiet, and a tense, dangerous hope began to dawn in the besieged farmhouse. Perhaps the wards were enough. Perhaps, offended and denied, it had given up and retreated into the darkness. The thought was shattered by a sound that was somehow worse than the roar, worse than the scratching. It was the explosive crash of heavy timber giving way, a sound of catastrophic destruction coming not from the house, but from the barn. "No," Marcos breathed, the color draining from his face. The barn was more than a building. It was his sanctuary, his kingdom. It held his tools, the gleaming new welder he was still paying off, the half-rebuilt tractor engine that was his great project, the machinery that represented his entire life's work, and his one desperate hope for clawing his way out of debt. The attack wasn't random. It was personal. It was strategic. The beast was crippling them, destroying their ability to fight back, their ability to survive even if they lived through the night. Primal instinct overrode calculated fear. Marcos grabbed the shotgun and a heavy mag-light flashlight and lunged for the door. "Stay here," he yelled, a useless command. Leo was right behind him, armed with a heavy iron tire iron he'd found by the hearth, his fear of the monster now secondary to the new, terrifying fear of his father facing it alone. Ignazio, his face grim, grabbed the kerosene lamp, its light swinging wildly, and followed. They couldn't stay separated. To be alone was to be dead. The scene at the barn was one of methodical chaos. The massive sliding door had been torn from its metal runners and tossed aside like a piece of balsa wood. Inside, in the sweeping, frantic beams of their flashlights, they saw the monster. It was bigger up close than Leo could have possibly imagined, a hulking nightmare of corded muscle and matted dark fur that seemed to drink the light. It stood on two powerful digitigrade legs, but its posture was all animal. Its head a hellish fusion of a timber wolf and a man, with intelligent, malevolent yellow eyes that glowed with a feral light of their own. It was methodically destroying everything Marcos valued. It crushed his half-finished woodworking project, a small rocking horse for a neighbor's new baby, under its heel. It tore the wiring from the tractor engine with a flick of its wrist. It was an act of desecration. "Get away from there!" Marcos screamed, a cry of pure paternal anguish for his broken dreams, and he fired the shotgun. The blast was deafening in the cavernous space, the buckshot peppering the creature's thick hide like inconsequential rain. It roared in fury, a sound that shook the very rafters and turned its full, undivided attention from the machinery to them. It was impossibly fast. It didn't charge. It flowed across the floor, a wave of shadow and muscle. It lunged, not at Marcos who held the gun, but at the space between them, a brilliant tactical move that cut him off from his son and father. Marcos scrambled backward, his feet tangling in a scattered pile of logging chains. He fell hard, the shotgun clattering from his nerveless grasp. The creature was on him in an instant, a clawed hand as big as a dinner plate raised to strike, the claws extended like black obsidian knives. Time seemed to bend and stretch. Leo saw his father, helpless on the ground. He saw the descending claws. He didn't think. He acted on pure filial instinct. He grabbed a half-full can of gasoline from a shelf and hurled it with all his might. It wasn't a perfect throw. It didn't hit the creature, but it splashed on the concrete floor near the lit kerosene lamp Ignazio had carefully placed by the entrance. "Grandpa, the lamp!" Leo screamed, his voice cracking. Ignazio, his old mind moving with lightning speed, understood instantly. He kicked the lamp over. The flame touched the spreading pool of gasoline. With a violent whoosh, a wall of fire erupted, a curtain of roaring orange flame that separated the beast from Marcos. The creature recoiled, snarling, its fur singed, momentarily blinded by the sudden, intense heat and light. In that split second of hesitation, Ignazio's voice, frail but somehow powerful, cut through the chaos. He screamed a single, strange, guttural verse in the old language of his ancestors. It wasn't a prayer. It was a command, a word of power that vibrated in the air. The beast flinched, as if it had been physically struck. It shook its massive head, clutching at its ears, disoriented by the ancient sound and the searing fire. It gave them one last look of pure, unadulterated hatred, and then bounded out through the shattered doorway, a dark meteor disappearing into the night. They had saved Marcos. For a breathless moment they stood together in the fiery, chaotic light, a terrified but triumphant unit. The victory, however, was fleeting. The beast, denied its kill, was enraged beyond reason. They heard its furious, frustrated howl, closer now, right outside. And then the sound they had all been dreading, the sickening, explosive shattering of glass from the house. They sprinted back, bursting through the kitchen door to find the main living room window, a gaping maw of broken shards and splintered wood. The creature was half inside, its massive shoulders wedged in the frame, trying to pull its bulk through. In the desperate, clumsy scramble to beat it back with the tire iron and a broken chair leg, it lashed out blindly, Its claws raked across Inacio's side, tearing through his thick coat and deep into the flesh of his left arm. The old man cried out, a sharp, choked sound, and staggered back, his hand coming away from his arm slick with dark, terrifyingly real blood. The sight of his father, wounded and bleeding because of this thing, broke the last of Marcos's control. The terror and grief boiled over into pure, undiluted rage. "This is your fault," he screamed at Inacio, his voice raw and shaking. "With your superstitions and your land spirits. We should have left. We should have gotten in the truck and driven away when we had the chance." "And go where?" Inacio gasped, clutching his arm, his face pale with pain and fury. "You cannot run from the soil you stand on. You brought this on us. You disrespected the traditions. You angered the land with your noise and your debts. Stop it. Just stop it, both of you," Leo shrieked, his voice cracking with a boy's terror and a man's frustration. He was trapped, a child again caught between his father's failed logic and his grandfather's failing magic. They were wounded. The house was breached. Their fragile, momentary alliance had been utterly destroyed, immolated by years of resentment, fanned by fear. Outside, the beast wrenched itself free of the window frame, tearing away more wood and siding. It stood in the yard, its chest heaving, its hot breath misting in the cold air. It didn't need to attack again. It had broken their bodies and their spirits. It lifted its head to the starless sky and let out a long, triumphant, soul-chilling howl. It had won. The creature's victorious howl faded into the night, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was the crushing, absolute silence of utter defeat. They were huddled in the wrecked living room, the cold night air smelling of pine and damp earth, pouring through the shattered window like an invading army. The stink of blood was sharp and metallic in the air. The shouting was over, extinguished by a wave of cold, hard despair that was more paralyzing than fear. Marcos stared at the dark, ragged wound on his father's arm, a wound that was still sluggishly weeping blood. The anger drained out of him, siphoned away, leaving behind a hollow, cavernous ache of guilt. Inacio leaned heavily against the wall, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. It was Inacio who spoke first, his voice weak but strangely clear in the dead quiet. He wasn't looking at Marcos, but at a dark water stain on the floorboards, as if he were seeing a ghost from a half-century ago. "My father, his name was Bento," he said, his words barely a whisper. "We fought, just like this, right here in this room. He wanted to keep the old ways, the horse and plow that had fed his family for 100 years. I wanted a tractor. I had seen one in town. I told him he was a foolish old man, afraid of the future, afraid of progress." He paused, taking a ragged breath that hitched in his chest. "I didn't understand then. He wasn't afraid of the tractor. He was afraid of being erased. Afraid that everything he was, everything he knew, every callus on his hands, would be plowed under the dirt and forgotten. That the song of the land would be replaced by the roar of an engine, and that no one would be left who knew how to listen." He finally lifted his head and looked directly at his son, his old eyes glistening with unshed tears in the dim lamplight. "It is not the traditions I cling to so fiercely, Marcos. It is the fear. The same fear my father had. The fear of my life, my work, my entire existence meaning nothing. The fear of being the last one who remembers the song." The confession was a quiet, devastating blow. It struck Marcos with the force of a physical impact, because in his father's raw, painful words, he heard the perfect, horrifying echo of his own deepest anxieties. His obsessive fight for the farm, his furious calculations in the ledger, his worship of efficiency and machinery, it was all rooted in the same terror. The fear of failure, the fear of being the one who finally lost it all, who let the song die. The dam of his anger and pride, built over a lifetime of resentment, finally broke. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, the words thick and clumsy in his throat. "I'm sorry." He moved to his father's side, fumbling in the kitchen for a clean dish towel, and pressed it gently against the bleeding wound. Leo watched them, a silent observer of this painful, long-overdue ceasefire. His own fear was momentarily forgotten, replaced by a strange clarity. He saw them not as the warring, immovable figures of his childhood, but as two deeply flawed, frightened men, finally seeing each other through the smoke and ruin. He looked at the broken tools in the corner, the useless symbols of his father's world. He looked at the strange, ash and salt symbols on the door, the failing wards of his grandfather's. He looked down at his own phone, its screen now black, its battery dead, his own world extinguished. 3 separate worlds, 3 failures, and in that moment of total failure, a desperate, insane idea began to form in his mind, an idea born of synthesis. "It's not your way or your way," Leo said, his voice quiet but steady, drawing their weary attention. "It's been in front of us the whole time." He looked at Ignacio. "The story, Grandpa. You said it's tied to the land. You said it cleanses weakness, that it's drawn to the bloodline." He turned to his father. "Dad, your tools, the old thresher in the barn, the big McCormick. Does it work at all?" Marcos looked at him, his brow furrowed in confusion. "The old thresher? Leo, that thing hasn't run in 20 years. The drive belt rotted away, the pistons are probably fused with rust. It's a monument, not a machine." "But you could fix it?" Leo pressed, his voice gaining urgency. "If you had to? If our lives depended on it? Could you bypass the engine, hotwire it with the car battery just for a few seconds?" A flicker of understanding, of dawning, horrified possibility, sparked in Marcos's eyes. He thought for a long moment, his mechanic's mind running through the possibilities, the challenges. "Maybe," he said slowly, the word hanging in the air. "The main gears are solid steel. If I could get power directly to the drive motor, yes, maybe. It would be a miracle." Leo turned back to Ignacio. "Grandpa, a real weakness. Not something to offend it, something to stop it. Is there one?" Ignacio's gaze was distant, as if he were searching the farthest corners of a long-forgotten library. "The legends say it cannot be killed by normal means, for it is more spirit than flesh. But it is bound by rules. It is prideful. It cannot resist a direct challenge from the bloodline that works the land." He paused, his eyes locking onto Leo's, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And it has one vulnerability. Not to wolfsbane, not to salt, but to silver. Not just any silver. It must be silver that has been consecrated by the family's history, by love and by loss." Slowly, with his good hand, Ignacio reached into his shirt and pulled out a thin, dark leather cord from around his neck. At the end of it was a simple, worn silver ring. His wedding band, which he had worn on this cord, over his heart, every day for the 20 years since his wife had died. He brought it to his lips and kissed it softly. He held the ring out to Leo. "This will hold its attention. It will draw it like a moth to a flame. It will see it not just as a challenge, but as the heart of our family's story, the ultimate prize to be destroyed." The final, desperate gamble was clear. A trap, a lure, a sacrifice. Leo looked at the simple silver ring glowing faintly in the lamplight. He looked at his father's grease-stained, capable hands. He looked at his grandfather's bleeding arm and fierce, hopeful eyes. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic drum of pure, primal terror. But beneath the fear was something new, something he didn't recognize in himself, a fierce, defiant resolve. This was his land. This was his family. This was his fight. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and closed his hand around the silver ring. It was warm from his grandfather's skin. There was no time for second thoughts, no room for the fear that was screaming in Leo's mind. He tied the thin leather cord around his neck, the old silver ring settling against his chest, a cold, heavy promise. He looked at his father, who was already a blur of motion, gathering a small toolkit, a pair of heavy jumper cables, and the car battery from their aging pickup truck, his face a grim mask of focused purpose. He looked at his grandfather, who stood by the door, pale and shaky, but who gave him a single solemn nod of trust that felt heavier than any burden. This was it. Leo took one last deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold, pre-dawn air, and burst out through the shattered frame of the front door. He landed on the damp earth and screamed into the darkness, his voice a raw, cracking cry of defiance. "Hey, you want a prize? You want the heart of this family? It's right here. Come and get me." For a moment there was only the ringing in his own ears. The silence stretched, and a sliver of doubt pierced his resolve. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it wouldn't work. Then from the deep shadows near the tree line, two yellow eyes ignited like embers in the dark. A low, rumbling growl answered his challenge, a sound of pure, possessive hunger. The hunt was on. Leo didn't wait for an invitation. He sprinted across the yard, his city sneakers slipping on the wet grass, his feet flying over the familiar ground of a childhood he'd tried to forget. He knew every dip and rise, every treacherous route. He could hear the creature behind him, a sound out of a nightmare, the thunder of its heavy, powerful footfalls shaking the earth, the rasping, eager sound of its breath. It was faster than he had imagined, a relentless force of nature closing the distance with terrifying ease. He rounded the side of the house, his lungs burning, and made a straight line for the gaping, dark maw of the ruined barn. He could hear Marcos inside, a frantic litany of curses and prayers as he worked on the ancient thresher's engine, the desperate scrape and click of metal on metal. He wasn't going to make it. The beast was right behind him, so close he could smell its scent. A feral mix of wet fur, damp earth, and something else, something metallic like old blood. Its shadow fell over him, swallowing the faint starlight. With a final, desperate burst of speed, Leo threw himself through the barn entrance, tucking and rolling as he hit the dirt and straw-covered floor. He scrambled to his feet just as the monster filled the doorway, its massive form blotting out the world behind it. It paused, its huge head low, its glowing yellow eyes fixated on the simple silver ring that lay against Leo's heaving chest. It took a slow, deliberate step inside, its claws clicking on the concrete floor. The trap was set. "Now, Dad!" Leo screamed, his voice raw. Marcos slammed the jumper cable clamps onto the rusted terminals of the thresher's starter motor. There was a bright, violent shower of sparks, a loud grinding groan of protesting metal, and then nothing. The engine sputtered, coughed once, and died. A horrifying, triumphant grin, a grotesque stretching of lips over yellowed fangs, seemed to spread across the beast's lupine face. It took another slow step forward, then another, savoring its victory. Leo was backed against the silent, rusted hulk of the threshing machine, the tire iron he'd grabbed feeling as useless as a toothpick in his hand. It was over. All for nothing. The beast coiled its powerful legs and lunged. "Aniegla goga queer fidi aniteri do shwile." The voice was weak, reedy, and laced with pain, but it rang through the barn with the authority of ages. Ignacio stood swaying in the barn doorway, his face as pale as death, his wounded arm held tight against his body. He screamed the old words, the ancient verse, a direct command in the tongue of the land itself. A curse upon the eyes of the faithless. The creature, in mid-lunge, flinched violently, as if struck by a physical blow. It twisted its head towards the old man, its true, ancient enemy, distracted for a single vital heartbeat. In that instant, Marcos, with a roar of his own, gave the terminals one last desperate shove, putting his entire weight behind it. The connection caught. With a deafening, apocalyptic roar, the ancient thresher shuddered to life. Its long, rotted belt snapped and whipped through the air. Its massive gears, coated in the rust of 20 years, screamed in protest, and its huge, interlocking metal teeth began to churn with a slow, grinding, and utterly unstoppable force. The beast turned back towards Leo, its eyes wide with surprise, but it was too late. The boy dodged aside, and the creature's own powerful momentum carried it forward, straight into the grinding, roaring maw of the revitalized machine. The sound was sickening, a wet, final, percussive crunch of bone and sinew, instantly drowned out by the shriek of tortured metal as the gears bit deep. For a second, The whole machine shuddered, threatening to stall, and then it powered through. The sound stopped as abruptly as it began. The thresher's engine, its last duty performed, sputtered, coughed a final plume of black smoke, and died, plunging the barn into a profound, ringing silence. The silence held. It was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic drip of something dark and thick from the now still jaws of the machine onto the dusty floor, and, from somewhere outside, the first, hesitant, hopeful chirp of a morning bird. Dawn was breaking. Soft gray light began to filter into the barn, illuminating the scene of carnage and salvation. Leo was on the ground, his back against the machine, shaking uncontrollably in the aftermath of adrenaline. Marcos was slumped against the side of the thresher, his body trembling with exhaustion, and a release so profound it felt like grief. Ignacio leaned heavily in the doorway, a pale ghost in the gathering morning mist. Slowly, painfully, as if moving through deep water, they came together in the center of the barn. There were no words. There was no need for them. Marcos went to his father. This time he didn't just press a towel to the wound. He gently peeled back the makeshift bandage and, using antiseptic and clean gauze from the house's first aid kit, began to properly clean and dress the wound, his mechanic's hands surprisingly tender and sure. Leo, his hands still shaking, walked over to a corner of the barn where a small overturned table lay amidst the debris. He knelt and picked up a small, dust-covered picture frame from the dirt floor. He wiped the glass clean with the sleeve of his torn shirt. It was a faded photograph of a much younger Ignacio and a boyish Marcos, standing proudly beside a brand-new gleaming red tractor. Both were squinting in the bright sun, and on the boy's face was a small, reluctant smile of shared pride. He walked back and stood beside his father and grandfather, holding the photo. The three of them stood there for a long time as the sun climbed higher, its warm golden rays spilling through the shattered barn door, illuminating the dust motes and the wreckage. They were surrounded by ruin, their bodies were bruised and bleeding, and their future was a terrifying, uncertain blank slate. But the oppressive, heavy silence that had suffocated them for years was gone, replaced by the quiet, gentle hum of the waking world. Finally, Ignacio, his good hand steady, reached out and placed it on Marcos's shoulder. A moment later, Marcos, his task finished, reached out and put his own hand on Leo's shoulder. They stood there, a single, unbroken line of 3 generations, their hands connecting them, a circuit of shared pain and survival. They turned, and together they faced the rising sun and the monumental, daunting task of rebuilding. The hunt was over. The healing was just beginning.